This panel is going to be full of jokes and laughter, so just get ready. Welcome, everyone, to this fourth day of the Summer Institute. So excited to see a lot of faces here that I haven't seen in the last few days. And hi, Michelle. Hi, Ellen. So I'll get going. Okay. So my name is Nasrin Himada. I'm the Associate Curator here at Agnes of Academic Outreach and Community Engagement. I'm also a Curator of Contemporary Arts outside this institution as well, especially my true love has always been cinema and new media, and I'm very much connected to thinking through that framework all the time. Also want to acknowledge that we are on the lands of the Anishinaabe and the Haudenosaunee, and I am of Palestinian origin. My ancestors come from Palestine. I'm always thinking about being in between worlds, that of Palestine and that of being here on these lands, thinking a lot about liberation, sovereignty, self-determination, through the ways in which I try to create space when it comes to exhibition making and programming, and just in my life generally and in the relations that I build. Oh, hi, Sebastian. So happy to see you. So yeah, thank you all for being here. I'm going to just kind of do, because I know all these amazing people, and I'm gonna, in some ways, the entire panel is going to be an introduction to their incredible work. But just to say a little bit about why I organized this and my intention, Emelie, Maiko, Bopha, and Pamila have been these great inspiration to me in regard to how we can think differently about conditioning spaces for gathering and for being together and for building trust and for thinking about. We've been thinking a lot about care with Tien, and I feel like their practice really is such a good example of how we practice care, how we practice being with each other, how we practice, in some ways, trusting each other and thinking together about how to really how to transform the spaces that we're in, and also how to transform ourselves. And I think often we're thinking externally, but I also feel like the work that these incredible curators and artists do is about also internal transformation that also affects what goes on around. And so I want to, everyone knows Emelie Chhangur, I'm very sure. I was the director and curator at Agnes, who's my boss, but today I'm not talking to you as my boss.
Okay, got that out of the way.
But who I feel like I've been watching and thinking about Emelie's work for years, and just so excited that you said yes to this invitation to think also about InReach, which is a methodology that you practice and that you bring into the spaces where you work, and thinking through the relationship between pedagogy and the civic, and we're going to talk a little bit about that today. And then Maiko Tanaka, who is a close dear friend of mine, who I feel like I became interested in curation because of the work that Maiko did in Toronto and in Buffalo and elsewhere, at TSV in Toronto. And one of the programs we're going to maybe hopefully talk about today is extracurricular. That was the first time that I was really introduced to the idea of thinking about pedagogy and curation. And that for me was such an important event years ago, 2009. Yeah. And then Bopha Chhay was the curator and director of Art Speak for many years in Vancouver. And I have been in total admiration of the work that you do on the ground in your neighborhood, Art Speak's neighborhood, in the way that you think about community relations and the art gallery as a space that opens up onto community and thinking through the different relationships that you've built in Gastown. And then Pamila Matharu, who's been installing her incredible research project and exhibition space at Agnes. Please, if you haven't yet checked it out, to do that afterward. The show is up until December. It's called Where Were You in '92? And I feel like the ways in which you created that space was this really incredible way of thinking about counter-archive, as you have brought to my attention your practice of counter-archiving and to thinking through mentorship and the ways in which to give space to someone that really inspired you, who's Winsome, to think about artist-run programs like Fresh Arts back in the 90s in terms of how they have impacted many generations and continue to do so through your own mentorship and the way that you are also a teacher. I think that's so incredible to think about. Artist as curator and also as mentor and teacher. Welcome, and I think I'll get going on our first question, and it's for you, Pamela. We're going to start there. Okay. So since this panel is inspired by your research project, Where Were You in '92? And I wanted you to talk to this beautiful audience about your trajectory as an artist, your love for Winsome, and why archives are important to you.
Started from the margins, now I'm here. It's a joke, guys. Thank you so much for this invitation, Nasrin, Emelie, for inviting me to take up space here at Agnes. It's my first solo museum project in Ontario and Canada, and I guess those things don't matter in the long run, but here I am. So I come from Treaty 13, Takaranto. That's where I live and work, and I was born in the West Midlands in the UK, aka Birmingham, which is second largest city to London. It's a beautiful city. You should definitely put it on your itinerary next time you're in the UK. And at 2.5 in May of 1976, my family arrived to Rexdale, Ontario, and then we moved to Concord, North York, and then I moved out on my own to Toronto around late 30s. So, which was, for a Gen X, that wasn't very common, but now for millennials and zennials, sandwiching and whatnot is very common. So I did it first. No. So my roots are from Punjab, and I'm Punjabi Sikh, and this is all important in terms of how I got to Fresh Arts and Winsome, so I'm just going to give you some of that background. And West Punjab is now Pakistan, India, and East Punjab is now Pakistan. So Punjab was split in two, and then Punjab and India was split 5 times, or a total of 5 times. And we just had the 75th anniversary of partition on Monday, so there's still like active wounds there. In around 1984, my family moved to Willowdale in North York. I was in grade 6, but by the time I go through middle school, junior high, we called it in North York, and I got to A.Y. Jackson Secondary School. The William Clark and Roger Messenger were very much trailblazers in art education, and I say this because they were also some of my preliminary models, I would say. But unfortunately, 5 days before my 16th birthday, my father took his own life, and I found him hanging. And that kind of froze me, I would say. And one day I'm in class. I mean, I'm just kind of playing class clown as I do now too. But, that we have learned through people and humans that, this is a mode of survival at times. And Mr. Clark saw through my depression, I think, and before I even recognized it and that what I was dealing with. And I disclosed, he asked me to enter his office. He saw me drawing something and he asked me to enter his office. I was like, okay. And his grandson was often around, and he's like 6 or 7, and I was like, why is this 7-year-old like here in high school, like, okay, in the middle of the day? But what I found out was, after I disclosed what had happened that summer, Mr. Clark told me that his daughter was suicidal, and so he has to take care of his grandson. So he immediately then transfers me from regular visual arts to the gifted art program in AY Jackson. And it was, before we amalgamated our board, it was very much we went head to head with like Earl Haig. You might have heard like Claude Watson and Earl Haig, and like I'm thinking of someone like Karma Clark Davis went to Haig. So like, there's and Sherry went to Wexford. So there's like these 5 kind of arts schools in TDSB, but then there's also enrichment programs, advanced programs, and gifted programs. So I say this because, I was learning art history and Western art history from Mr. Clark, but nothing was really reaching me. And then 1992, my grades didn't really get me into York, but I got this Herbert H. Carnegie Award, who is the first black hockey player in Canada. So something to note. And scholarship. And then I bounced around. I wish I didn't pay to bounce around the way kids bounce around in high school these days, but I went to Ryerson, U of T continuing education, OCA, when it was known as OCA, and then spring of 94, I end up at York finally. And I kind of went through the back door, through, Atkinson College, which doesn't exist anymore. And then I have like 2 strikes that I endure over 8 years, 5 failed courses because I came out. It was beautiful, which is like a queer pedagogy in itself. And then I get into consecutive B.Ed. I don't know how, but they let me in. And I finished with this distinction, my B.Ed, but I failed 5 undergraduate courses, so I'm just shy of an honors. I'm just disclosing this publicly, first time in my life. And then that summer of 94, I see an ad at the back of Now Magazine. Remember Now Magazine? And remember how thick the sex ads were? Oh my gosh. And I see this little ad buried about, a youth arts program, and it's Fresh Arts. I start calling the office because pre-internet, which some of you in the room might remember. And I'm calling, and they don't answer the phone. And it's like, they finally answer the phone, and I'm like, I need to be in the visual arts. And they're like, no, we're at capacity, we're full, but we'll ask the arts leader. And I'm like, okay. I eventually get on the phone with Winsome, and she's like, why do you think you need to be here? And I'm like, because I'm like bored as fuck in North York, and you got to let me in. And what happened was, between the second time I called and third time I called, I'm listening to the Master Plan show. Does anybody remember the Master Plan show? It's still existing. Oh, hey, how are you doing? And Master Plan show is the longest running hip hop show on CIUT radio, and it was co-founded by Motion, Wendy Brathwaite, who was one of the mentors in, she was only a couple of years older than me, but she was mentoring the spoken word. And so when you'll see in my show, I speak of the Yonge Street Uprising and whatnot. I came in 2 years after, right? So 1992, and that was because the government or the funding bodies were going to cut the funding if they didn't raise the bums in the seats. So I get in as a racialized youth. That's the year they allowed. So it was only specifically for Black and Indigenous youth, and I was the first cohort for the racialized youth. And basically, Fresh Arts was a very groundbreaking multidisciplinary arts program funded by Jobs Ontario Youth, which was created by Bob Ray after the report that Stephen Lewis wrote, which was called Report on Race Relations. And this was a youth employment strategy, Jobs Ontario Youth, funded by the Ontario government. And then Fresh Arts came about because 4 women came together with Bob Ray. One of them was the advisor, special advisor to the NDP government, Lillian Allen, Marie Mumford, who is based in Peterborough, Trent University. And she's like some special designated funded what is that called? SHIRK? Or no, it's Canada Research Chair something something. I don't know. Me in academia, I don't know. Aita Sadhu and Winsome Winsome. So this artist-led program was specifically made for Black youth and Indigenous youth. And the Black Arts, I would say, yeah, it's part of the Black Arts movement in Canada, I'd like to say. But it's not been recorded anywhere. So Emelie gave me an opportunity to put on record, this existence that I have been embodying for a long time and probably driving her crazy, because I always come back to, back in 1990s, and because, she's done work in Jane and Finch, of course, with InReach and Scarborough, and all these amazing things. And I always try to acknowledge the past, right? Because she's also worked with Mishi Me, and I'm like, you got to go before that, So there is a trajectory there. For me, just to answer your rest of your question, so one other thing, it's a multidisciplinary program: writing, theater, spoken word, music, dance, and visual arts. And I think visual arts has not gotten its, its play from like the way Cardinal Fischel or Julie Black or Socrates or all these people have gotten to be on press and on record, and then there'll be one line about fresh arts. And I'm always like, dang, like, why can't you guys elaborate, Like, you're here now. Because, like, we're here, but like Toni Morrison says, your job is to lift. You get here, now you lift. Don't waste time. Close the gaps, right? So, it's grounded me from then to now, informed and influenced my teaching, my arts practice. Sorry, I need notes because I'm ADD. 100%. Community engagement, collaboration, arts advocacy, artist-led, facilitating, coaching, teaching, mothering, caring, foster parenting at times, and cultural production. End of Fresh Arts Summer, Winston looks at me and says, I got something for you. And I was like, what's that? And she turns the corner on Suite 906 at 96 Banana. And she's like, you need to meet some folks. And I was like, who are they? It's Desh Pradesh. She saw me coming out before I saw my coming out, So Desh Pradesh, and then, from there, the next summer, Jobs Ontario Youth were like, you know what, we want you to get more exposure. I meet Dr. Amal Harris from Theatre in the Rough. From there, in that cohort, I meet Debbie Young, Claire Yao, her mom was a very amazing Asian social justice leader in the Chinese community. Tanisha Shuri Bhagyadatta, who's Chris Shanta's niece. He's a poet. And I forget the last person, who's based in San Francisco and now is like a city councilor. But anyways, we're like these like young women, and our project was to make a guide for youth how to deal with police. Right? So this trajectory for me, I've always been adjacent and in proximity to Black thought and Black cultural production, Black feminist cultural production. And I guess this is my way of not just citing it, but saying it publicly, that we all learn from Black culture. You want to stop talking about white supremacy? Talk about the other communities you learn from, right? And share from. Like, that's it. So then I go back to Winsome, like, now what? And she's like, keep going. Go now and penetrate the center. And I was like, what does that mean? Because, when I hear penetration, I'm just like, okay, what are you saying to me, right? And then I meet Judith Tater at Tater Alexander, and the rest is history around my commercial kind of, I worked for dealers and private collectors and philanthropists after that, and I met the Greens and the Zeidlers, and, they were very, very influential around learning about in proximity to philanthropists too, so I'm not going to discount that experience. Like rich white folks, oh my God, yes, in the arts, And then 1997, out of Desh Pradesh, I was a co-founding steering committee member of South Asian Visual Arts Collective, which is now called South Asian Visual Arts Center, but it's a gallery-less artist center. And then from there, I went to Paddock. And then from Paddock, I got that time period, which is Professional Art Dealers of Canada. And then I learned about, oh my gosh, like donations. Woo. You know, I had to write up donation reports, so I know who's, you know, there's probably like less than 10 families in Canada that really contribute to the visual arts sector. Okay, and the baiters. And my first curatorial experience was come out of SAVAC. It was called Dirty Laundry and Parting Thoughts. And I go back to one of the people that Winsome introduces to me, Zahoor Akhlaq, who had just come back representing Pakistan at the Venice Biennale. And he gave me those paintings, which for a 25, shy of 25 curator, I was like, what? You're going to do what? And he's like, try not to like, you know, just make sure like the shipping containers and like don't break it up and all that. And I was like, that's all you're going to say to me? And that's what he did. And then come 1998, I just asked Emelie, I'm like, was Marilyn with me or did we meet on our own at the power plant? She was trying to sell me this multiple. And I'm like, what? Power plant handed a non-white brown woman? Like, I got to meet you. And then I just never stopped bugging Emelie since. But yeah, we've been jamming since then. Right, Em?
It's like 20 years?
More than. Like, so the summer of 92, that's 30-year anniversary. So yeah, it's like between 25, 28, I don't know. Wow. Who knows? Numbers. Let's decolonize that.
Thanks, Pamela. There's so many things there. And, you know, there are a lot of, I mean, there's SAVAC and there's so many organizations that are just so important in Toronto that have been such a space for many racialized artists and continue to be so important. And I feel like, yeah, it's so, thank you for mentioning that.
Yeah, for sure,
sure. Okay, I'm going to actually read out this question, Maiko, because I don't want to mess it up. Since extracurricular had such an impact on me as a curator, but also paved the way for so much to happen in Toronto when it came to the relation between the curatorial and pedagogy, practices based in research, how they were essential to creating the conditions for collectivity to form. Can you speak about this event, how it came about, what you recall, and what impact that had on your practice as a curator and writer?
Hello? Okay. Hey, first, thanks for having me. Nice to see everyone. So now I'm inspired by Pamela to like do a trajectory, but just for context, I guess. So I'm going to start from art school. So I went to OCAD. By fourth year, I was in the criticism curatorial practice. By fourth year, I was really dissatisfied and disillusioned because it felt like every classroom, every class was just not creatively taught. Like it was just, you know, I mean, some teachers, I had really incredible teachers, but the way it was structured felt like not breaking any boundaries around how we learn and as learning as a artistic practice or teaching, you know, or even like how those things can be broken down too. So in my fourth year, I decided to create for my thesis project, an underground art school for one night. We called it a night school, after school supplemental. And I became the director, and I had the director portrait, and I had this whole outfit with like thick glasses, and I looked like Rosemary Donegan. I was trying to like, I don't know if you remember Rosemary, yeah. And then I had like a whole, you know, director's message for the night, and basically curated different artists and artist lectures, pretending this was like a real night school, and installations and performances like Louis Jacobs' Anarchist School Minutes and Rhys Horowitz's the violin lessons and the Amos Latcher's lecture on models and Irene Moon on cockroaches, and it just felt really like vivid and alive and fun. And I think at that time I was like, it was basically just imagining and making happen what I wanted to see more of or like be involved in more of. And I didn't think at the time of things like, wasn't exposed to pedagogy of the oppressed, Paulo Freire, which became really important for me later, and the idea of like going against the banking model of education, where you're like depositing knowledge into a learner, but also like for the oppressed, like it's not about learning about the world, but making the world. And so that, you know, when I was exposed to that, that's like start to get a language for it. So then, what happened next? But then when I was doing that, someone introduced I think it was Vidingelevics, who said, hey, you know, you should meet Janet Graham. She's like across the way at the AGO, and she's working on this amazing teen council program where I don't remember when we spoke if she was articulating this way, but what I remember about it was it's like again, the education departments, like the underground school, they're always on the bottom floor and not seen, you know, in the gallery. I mean, yeah, and of course you know Janet Graham too, yeah. And she was like, it was like having students, instead of taking these art classes, using the floors above as content and knowledge and then expressing themselves down on the floor, it was having them infiltrate up into the galleries and like ask really good questions about boundaries and who's allowed to be in the space and what objects are in the space, how they got there. And then I remember like a skateboarding project where they were like looking at like barriers, but also, you know, this kind of activity that's seen as not high art or like it's appropriate. And like thinking about age in a completely different way. So that was very exciting to hear about. And I wasn't really connecting it to politics at the time. Like at OCAD, I had the language for that. Like that it was about making your own space and finding a way to also find joy and fun and improvisation in learning together. So that was a great model. But she already had this like critical pedagogy language that I was starting to learn and start to read Henry Lefebvre, Giroux, that she was reading in Kingston. She actually went to Kingston. So then I went to Justina M. Bardicke Gallery, which is now Art Museum Toronto, and I was working with Barbara Fisher as a technical coordinator, and then eventually we had a common interest in education and art, and conceptual artists who were doing, we did this program called instructional videos by artists, and inspired by David Askevold's projects class at NSCAD, where he had different artists, even famous artists like John Baldessari give assignments to students to engage with space and their surroundings. So we did that. But then I started to when I started my residency, I was like, this feels limiting still. It's fun to see artists play with educational models and break down some of the, in ironic ways, but it wasn't participatory, or there was something about it still that felt like there was very few artists who were telling us this and making this commentary. But so then around 2006, I think, or 7 is when I started my research. It was a 2-year residency. And that time in Europe, there was a whole thing called the Bologna Accord that was taking place. And it's basically this, European education is known to be so, back then free, for so long, free. And in art, there was this apprentice master model or studio model, and I mean there's problematics with those too, but it was just this really different idea. And Bologna Accord was this thing across Europe that was going to mimic or model off of the American model, which is the neoliberal model of having education be commercialized and having it be getting people to be trained to become workers and to become part of these systems, and STEM is maybe an outcome of that later. So and then tuitions were actually getting really high. And in the UK, there were a lot of protests and organizing against that. And again, Jenna Graham pops up. She's part of many different collectives, Carrot Workers Collective, who work with interns to politicize and having them fight for their rights for their labor to be paid or to be acknowledged and be part of a system of making decisions together. And then, but another one where she co-organized a summit for radical education collectives to come together in response to the Bologna Accord and everything that's happening. And that's when I learned about these amazing radical collectives like Lilieka, Pinky Show, and Ultra Red, which she's part of. And so, which is it started with Dawn Ryan as a like AIDS campaign, activism, and their sound collective. But anyways, so then in the Netherlands, I was visiting Netherlands a lot for research trips because my partner Chris was also there, so I was just visiting him, and there was like all these conferences about education and art, like the pedagogical turn, the educational turn. eFlex had this like really legendary issue about this. Irit Rogoff on turning. I just remember all these. Do you remember those? Like, and every article was like became a conference, topic, and people talking about museum educators being sidelined in this conversation. All of a sudden, artists were the ones who had this like expertise on how to like make more critical education, but like, what about again the workers in the basement below? And like, so who was that? That was Nora Stensfeld who wrote that one. So there was like really good perspectives. And then so I went to this conference seeing all these people speak, and I was like, it was really a thing. And then I was like, I'm going to do a version of this in Toronto. And first it was like, okay, let's do the thing about institutions, and brought all these people from institutional position. And the second one was more like the summit. So like gathering all these radical collectives, including 3 from the many that were part of the summit, because through, again, this emergence, like it turns out that like a friend and this local artist, Rodrigo Hernandez, was like in the collective. Lilieka is basically Mexico City. They were a group that was working with prisons, and instead of art in prisons, like could you imagine the more the container model, the banking model, like pacifying, or they're co-creating and challenging ideas about masculinity, and in the prisons, and doing really there was a word, transversal was going around then, acts and together collective, like they did like what would a marriage be with all of us together? And they would like build on huge pink banner paper, like the certificate of the marriage, and then they would perform, like they were like, what would the ceremony look like? And they would do that, and they would do other things that were like, there's some gender dynamics that were really challenging, but they were just going for it. And then Pinky Show is like a project in Hawaii that was challenging, like they were like an indigenous, like working with thinking about decolonization in Hawaii, but through like a cartoon of these cute cats who were talking about this, and they even had an episode on art museums. Anyway, they came. So Hawaii, Mexico City, Ultra Red with Jana Graham and Elliot Perkins was the people who came, and then a bunch of local Toronto and Ontario collectives that were, one, I can't remember the name, but with Christine Shaw and Adrian Blackwell had a group that was part of Post-Fordist something. Does anyone remember? Post-Fordist. But basically they would work with... Is it Days of Action? No. It's like to work with like janitorial staff, with the cafeteria, like the food workers, the faculty, the students, in these more collective, or like unpack. I don't know if they actually did, but that was this movement across. There's groups around the world that were thinking about reoriented power relations within educational institutions. Anyway, so there was some interesting stuff, and people. So what was exciting, and like people just came in. Like Nasrin, you were there as a like whatever audience or whatever, but then this project, because of the collectives, and they were enthralled with each other. Like when they met and heard and saw what they were doing, there was this respect, because we're all working in very specific contexts. And so it's like not something you would compete with, not something you would compare. It was like there are people just learning, not to transfer those learning, but to engage and be in solidarity and also care for each other, because it's hard, that work. Yeah. So there was this like respect, love, care. We would spend time even just walking from location to location between workshops. going to Oise on the top floor for No One Is a Legal meeting, and then again the next day for a workshop about like
always around each other, around food. We went out dancing. Food. It was just like lots of hanging out.
Yeah. It was like this. We couldn't not be in this. You use the word orbit a lot, but it felt like that kind of thing. But not just the orbit, but the asteroids in between and the, anyways. We keep working on this metaphor. Anyway, blah blah blah. That's it. Yeah.
Thank you, Maiko. It was nice. I feel like I just have such a strong memory of that. I think I went to everything, and I remember being part of the Pinky Show program, and it was the first time that I was like, oh wow, like workshops. You were breaking boundaries around also the structure of workshops. It was like a 2-day, 8-hour hangout, basically, and that's what we did. We were just together for 2 days straight, yeah. Okay, Emelie. Aw, my hero. I know you talk about this often, and I was trying to figure out a way around InReach that would be also exciting for you to talk about it differently, like whatever hasn't come up for you around InReach and how you've been thinking about it since you've been in Kingston and at Agnes, and also just, I know I had sent you the question and I said why an emphasis. You're like a great orator. You don't need notes. Why an emphasis on the civic? And I asked that because I feel like space is very important to you. I feel like even the cityscape, the space of Toronto was very important to you, and how this InReach methodology was in practice for you. And now you're in Kingston, and I know Kingston has become a place that you also want to engage with and think about through this methodology. And so
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me on the panel to be with these amazing people. Place. So, I've thought a lot about my work in Toronto since being here, and I think that it was all about navigating and negotiating a sense of belonging to a place, but with the condition that as a mixed-race person, there was not a clear community with whom I belonged to. So I think, in so many ways I became a curator by accident, like a really different kind of path from art school and sculpture and installation to theater, to like sort of accruing a sense of the need to be in relation to people through collaborative frameworks, and the dramaturgy of that. So I think of my time in Toronto as like, especially my time at AGYU, as like a very long commitment to figuring out how to belong to a place over time. And this had bearing on the institutions of art. So I find myself in the institutions of art, which, arriving in them were obviously not built to support me. But, and being at the power plant, since Pamela brought this up, and a move to the AGYU was sort of the difference, or an early, 24-year-old realization that I wasn't interested, if I was going to be a curator, and I entered the curatorial field because I thought it was open and free and not disciplinary, and then I kind of learned this otherwise, that it is. But, making this decision that what was important to me is I didn't want to be a curator defined by an institution or shape. That was not my desire. My desire was not to be trained in a way that replicated sort of mainstream sensibility of what the curatorial was, but wanted to be someone who would change an institution. And moving to the AGYU was this moment, where downtown art community is like, why would you go all the way out there? And it was considered degraded, it was considered out of the center, it was considered and this feeling of like, why would that be characterized that way, when I actually thought it was super liberating to not have to address the center. Anyway, sorry, this is a little bit of a path, but even being out of the center and still thinking about what it means to belong to a place over time, I realized that the framework of the institution itself didn't allow for a kind of participation in it. I mean, I felt that myself earlier on, but working in collaboration with community, in particular local communities, I realized that the incommensurability of the institutions of art to practice and enact other kinds of cultural protocols, social economies, and ways of working that were outside of the sort of temporality and conveyor belt of a kind of framework that we didn't really fit into. Yeah.
What about Kingston?
I want to push this a little bit more because, it's also, I feel like I'm speaking abstractly because it's not grounded in projects, but I would say, there are some very definitive projects that I've learned through over the years that have sort of eroded the lines of the institution's practice. And I think, the first one I would name as The Awakening, which was a collaboration with a Panamanian artist, Humberto Velez, that brought together young parkour and the Mississaugas of the Credit, who I went on to have a 12-year ongoing collaboration with. And it's important to mention them because I think that's the origins of InReach in so many ways. And then a project with a Trinidadian artist, Marlon Griffith, that was a 300-person street procession that brought together the Mississaugas, capoeira practitioners, disability dancers, and young spoken word poets and rappers from Jane Finch and Scarborough. And then a film, Rise, which was a collaboration with spoken word poets and rappers and two artists from the northeast of Brazil, Barbara Wagner and Benjamin de Burca. And I'm saying these because I'm getting to Kingston, because I also think that, this transformations project and the graffiti is very much in that line. So I think I've rolled along with these projects and these collaborators because they were the only folks I could to find to build a kind of collaborative network and be with them as we navigated the structures and adopt some of those methodologies like parkour of navigating structures in a way that doesn't follow the grid lines of a city. Or I think I've always identified as an outsider within the institution and always sought to align myself with other outsiders, but to work on the inside to change why we feel like outsiders. And it's not, I've been thinking a lot about this because it's not about wanting to belong to a system of power. Like when I talk about this sense of belonging over time, it really was to, transform a social imaginary and mobilize structures toward transformational change. And, I thought about these projects always, they're kind of large scale, they're kind of over the top, but they always appropriate existing dramaturgical forms, like The Awakening's the civic ceremonial, Ring of Fire, I don't even think I mentioned the title of it, the street procession, it was a street procession. They're all modes of public address that recast the characters of these social dramas toward other ends. And they're temporary. I mean, the project's making happens for 3 years, but usually they're like a sort of 45-minute intervention in the public sphere. And so civic, speaking, I mean, the relationship of pedagogy and the civic, to me, has all kinds of bearing on how you transform those structures, because it is modeling up and, like, pedagogically speaking, modeling up other ways of learning and being and doing. But I've always, and like this is like my mixiness too, like my attraction to university galleries, which is also like where I think one can model this kind of like change, because you are, you have a pedagogical mandate, but it's a hybrid kind of institution, so it is funded by the government. And so I've always thought of the civic role of an institution because it receives government money. And so I think it must serve this social function by distributing that government money to other people. And I think that that's distributed through these networks of like the government, the Canada Council, then the art galleries that get them. So I'm always, of course, interested in working with non-artists or activists or street artists or parkour, because I identify those practitioners as already participating in transforming how we learn and the civic sphere. But I always was interested to bring into relation, because I know I haven't spoken about an object yet, because I'm always sort of bringing people, like individuals and groups who have no natural affinity together to work together over long periods of time, and that's the curatorial work. But that relationality as the curatorial is, I'm also very interested to bring city structures and institutions into relation. So there's always, within the curatorial set, and for instance, like Ring of Fire, with all these collaborators, alongside them is also the Ontario Legislative Assembly, City Hall, and 52 Division of the Toronto Police. So I'm interested in taking up these dramaturgical forms that are civic building and create the social imaginaries of a place, and operating on them with these protagonists that I'm collaborating with to transform them. So InReach begins within an institution of art, and then it sort of moved out into the civic sphere. And inside the institution of art, that InReach was also like how one bends to meet the methodological demands of the communities with whom one is working. That has bearing on timelines. Like, people don't just do things on this 3-month rotation. That had everything to do with payment of fees, and coming up with other sorts of forms of other kinds of gift economies to be in relation with people, so people are feeling compensated but not through a monetary situation, to then putting, for instance, Toronto City Hall into relation with the Mississaugas, under the auspices of this procession, which was also organized around the 7 grandfather teachings. So every time we were there, we were enacting these teachings with the city. And so InReach started to have this kind of operative influence on the very structures that I was trying to navigate and belong to. So it was always about transforming things around me. And now I'm a bit more cheeky, because I'm I don't sort of practice a discourse of inclusion. I'm not interested in being part of your club. I'm really always trying to eliminate assimilationist tactics of belonging. So everything else needs to change around me. But when I was younger, it was really how do you actually change these situations by putting pressure on them, but not in a critique methodology. I've actually not been, this is something else I've been thinking a lot about as I reflect. It hasn't been to critique, it's been to actually inhabit otherwise. Mm-hmm. And so, I mean, the critique is always there because we're doing it differently. But yeah, very true. Anyway, so sorry, I went on a bit of a tangent, but I wanted to get back to Kingston. And so anyway, so this in a way, is a curatorial practice, or a practice that bears on institutional protocols. And sort of in a move to coming here, I always wonder, can InReach become the institutional practice? And that's sort of how I arrived here, thinking, this is the opportunity to really apply an ethos and methodology of InReach to the very systems, structures, policies, and practices of the institution, not just have a bearing on it and how you can transform it from within, but actually just transform it. But now, being here, I also think there's a limit to this, because one is still always operating within a framework and a structure, and if I've been interested in dramaturgical structures for so long, I've become very interested in architectural structures. So I'm back to space. It's always like there in the background and occupying and taking up space and transforming space through alternative practices and world making. But now I'm like, there's actually the very structures, atmospheres, altitudes, and the way in which we walk in a front door. You could be a really rad museum, but if you still have a proscenium situation, or you still you start to recognize that actually the architecture itself is deeply pedagogical. Especially at a university gallery. I mean, this models up a form of behavior for all students on this campus when they walk through the door, and there's an encounter that teaches about values and class. And so now I'm like, the institution itself must become a practice. So it's not about bringing a practice to an institution to transform it from within. The institution itself must become a practice. An entirely different architecture must be built around that. So to move away from it being a container toward a proposition, which all of these projects and working collaboratively for 3 years, we never knew where we were going. We followed the projects with what I call eccentric curiosity, like with a dash, eccentric, and recalibrated as the project took on its own life and shape. And I'm wondering here, what does that mean to do that architecturally? What does one, where do we want to be? And what's the methodology to do that inside the institution, based on these sort of methodologies that I've learned from working from a practice. I've gained strength in being able to negotiate collaborative frameworks because I was taught by all of the people that were operating in these projects, and to model up a consensus way of thinking, and to so now it's like last night with Stephanie, I said, I think that the AGYU was an artist project, it was like an art project of mine. But Agnes is a curatorial project, a deeply curatorial project that actually is really thinking hardcore around relationality and how things are brought together, and the institution itself is a material to be worked with curatorially.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I'm ready to work. Bopha Chhay, thank you so much for being here all the way from Vancouver. I feel like we are, although you're all being celebrated here right now, Bopha just ended her tenure at ArtSpeak. And I feel like this is a true celebration. I have been obsessed with reading this interview. I think I've read it twice. I can't remember, you told me where it was published and I forgot.
Contemporary Hum, that one?
Yeah. And I pulled out this quote because I thought it would be such a good place for us to start in introducing your practice and talking a little bit about it. You said, I consider the surrounding context and the community as providing a really specific set of conditions and constraints. We are part of the neighborhood. We have a responsibility to get to know our neighbors and understand the conditions in which local residents live under or are subjected to and the reasons why. How has this approach created the conditions for your curatorial work and the methodologies formulated throughout your tenure at ArtSpeak?
Firstly, thank you so much to Nasrin and Agnes. This is like my heroes, so it feels really nice. So yeah, I just finished my tenure at ArtSpeak and have only slowly over the past, I actually haven't quite finished. There are a few things that I need to do, but technically yes. So I haven't really had much time to reflect fully on what I've been doing yet. So this is like a really wonderful opportunity to kind of think through a few of those things. And Nasrin, I know that we spoke a lot about like what a slow methodology means. And I think that's something I really tried to think very carefully about at ArtSpeak because, well, firstly, I grew up in Aotearoa, New Zealand and California, so I spent a lot of time traveling to be with my parents who lived on either side of the Pacific. And I think, Emelie, you mentioned this, like, what does it mean to belong somewhere? And I feel like that's something I've been kind of contending with, you know, personally and professionally for a very long time. And in terms of ArtSpeak, prior to ArtSpeak, you know, I've worked in several different artist-run centers, and I really like the freedom of artist-run centers, but also there are a lot of constraints, such as, you know, being as part of a staff of 2, you do all the jobs. And then so something you're constantly contending with is burnout. So this method of slow, you know, I still don't really know what exactly I was thinking, but it was really important for me to state that at the beginning of my tenure there because I was really, I really didn't want to kind of replicate the systems where I really felt like I was alienated from, like very deeply alienated from. So in terms of slow, I really felt like ArtSpeak has a mandate that is, you know, to create the conditions for a dialogue between visual arts and textual practices, so language. So I was really thinking about what it meant, what slowness meant, and how that was holding me accountable to not only myself, to like slow things down, because I feel like in the systems that we work, we're required to produce and tick so many boxes and just work at a pace that is not sustainable. So I was really trying to think about what is sustainable for myself and other staff member and a board of 7 people. And so a lot of the projects that I was working on, I was thinking, what have my favorite projects been? And all of them were my favorite projects. But there were like 4 kind of highlights, and they were incredibly slow and incredibly iterative, and maybe like punishing for some people because it's just like the same thing. But I'm like, no, it's different this time. How is it different? So I was really, with this idea of slowness, trying to build in time to reflect, because I feel like often we don't actually build that into our curatorial process or our writing. Like I was speaking to a friend recently, and we're always like one deadline behind. And so I was like, why is that? Like, we really need to, you know, to not make that a thing that we're just carrying around constantly. It's like this burden. So the 4 projects that I was, you know, I'm really proud of because of all the different people and different communities that were involved were a project called ArtSpeak Radio Digest, which was, we were thinking about publishing, but in the form of an audio journal, mainly because it's really hard to get money for publishing. So I was like, how do we do this? And then also it was part of this year-long program that we were running about writing in process and what it means to not just write and edit, but also write and perform and like more embodied forms of writing and speech. And that was kind of run in conjunction with another program called the Studio for Emerging Writers program, which was a 10-month program where it was a cohort of 8 to 12 young writers, not just arts writers, but we did want to focus on that because we kind of identified a few issues with what we saw was going on in arts criticism and writing. And so this was like a 10-month program where we invited artists every 2 weeks to come and give workshops on how they think about writing and language and text. And that was really incredible, and we've run like 2 cohorts of that, and then different variations on that. So that was kind of tied into the radio show, which was with Vancouver Co-op radio station, which is this incredible not-for-profit community radio station that has always been located like 1 block away from ArtSpeak. So we have this really long-running relationship with this radio station. And their values are really similar to ours in terms of like how we think about the neighborhood, how we think about workshops, like what's needed, and also just like making things accessible. So in terms of writing and language and these kind of long-term projects and queries that kind of spanned, I guess, several years actually, not just 1 year or 2 years, was thinking about language a lot in terms of, because our neighborhood is located in the downtown, I don't know if you know the downtown East Side gas town. It experiences incredible contradictory pressures and poverty and gentrification. And so that's what we're in the middle of. And, you know, part of our responsibilities there are that we need to know how to administer naloxone. We need to know first aid. We're constantly, so we're trained in all of that just because that's our responsibility being in that neighborhood. Mm-hmm. And I think that was really important for me because it made me consider a wider, think about our responsibilities not just to our art peers. Like I no longer felt like I was just speaking to the same kind of people about really particular niche interests. Like it really had to be quite different. And prior to that, I worked at 221A, which is an artist-run center in Chinatown, which also has really similar kind of social conditions that you need to kind of think about. So, those were like the 2 kind of main projects. What did I talk about? ArtSpeak Radio Digest, an expanded journal, the Studio for Emerging Writers program. There was one more. The Sensing Salon was something else, a project that I did pretty early on with Denise Pereira de Silva and Valentina Desideri, which was thinking about healing and what healing meant for that particular community. And, you know, I'm still kind of thinking about that one because it could be perceived as potentially pretty wishy-washy and airy-fairy, but I think it really opened out to so many other ways of thinking and what healing is and just different methodologies and ways of thinking and knowledge and how to speak, actually. So, you know, there was like Reiki and there were tarot readings and there were study groups, and these are kind of things that we continued throughout my tenure, informally or not informally. And I think, Maiko, I was thinking when you were speaking about how these students were in the basement. Sometimes I kind of like being in the basement, and sometimes a lot of our programs were not for everybody. Like, we have done quite a lot of programs for really specific groups and communities that we're not in the basement, but the doors are not open to everybody. And, you know, I've had to justify a lot of that to the arts community, nobody else. And I have no problems justifying why we need to keep the doors closed to do certain things. And I'm not always in the room either, which is totally fine. So, I think I'll end there for now.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you all so much. I feel like we're on the app. It's 11:06, so we've been going for an hour. I do have more questions, but I did want to just take a pause and open it up to the audience. Also, feel free to take a bathroom break or get a snack. But yeah, if the audience has any questions or thoughts, we can take some now. I'll give you a few seconds.
Let me see if I can formulate this in a meaningful way. I think what I'm thinking about, and I admitted to Deirdre and Allison the other day that I'm having a crisis of faith about my long commitment to working in institutions. So my question is, are your various intersections with art and academic institutions necessary for your work, or is your work necessary for your survival because you work in institutions? That's what I'm trying to figure out for myself, so I'd love to know what you think about that topic.
Thank you. Emelie's going to take.
Do you mind?
I just want to say one thing, which is Elder Duke Ellington said, home is where the work is.
I like this question because I don't know. I don't think I didn't start out very well with this sense of belonging. But for me, these projects that I mentioned are about my own survival. And actually, there is a reason that I continually go back to working with groups of folks who have no natural affinity, but certainly share a lot of structural inequities, is, I think, a very autobiographical practice of mine, which is constantly repeating a sort of cultural negotiation as a mixed race person. And also, I've gotten very good from my lived experience of negotiating in between cultures. And for me, it's less about, even though InReach has had this impact on institutional practice, for me, it is related to how a city looks, its aesthetics, and I've always been like sort of working toward what would a mixed race aesthetics be. But then I'm like always more interested in the methodology. How does one do that? How can you bring together practices and cultural protocols and ways of working and different cultural frameworks to create something new at their convergence? And I think that's what's autobiographical about all these works. And while for sure, in a way, there's a dependency on the institution in order to catalyze the resources to make those works, I think delinked from an institution, I would still gravitate toward these communities as a way of belonging to wherever I am. And I think it's like, I love this, like the neighborhood is very important to me too, and for me, 17 years it was in the Jane Finch community. But the projects and the slowness of these projects were also about who I hung out with. Like for 3 years, and I'm still in total contact with everybody, but my whole life would change. I would be at like the parkour meets and like, you know, poetry slams, and 3 years or 4 years later, we'd all be older. There was something about growing with all of these individuals that was very important to me. So I think it's deeply autobiographical.
Survival. We were speaking yesterday during Tian's reading Manifesto for Radical Care, and I was mentioning, sorry, I can't quite remember what the question was, but we were talking about like what we do in small ways to kind of ensure the way we sustain ourselves, and micro and macro. Thanks, Pamela. And at one point, I think at the beginning of the pandemic, I really felt like I was becoming a professional letter writer. I was just writing all these letters, mainly to city council and with other artist-run centers. So it's a kind of different type of organizing that I think sustains me. So something we do every October, November is write letters to the council to defund the police and reallocate funds in a way that is much more community-oriented. So I think things like that are really kind of crucial to me, and that's just like one example. Encouraging people to speak up at council, particularly in regards to new condos that are displacing people. I think things like that, even though it's like kind of off the side of, it's not part of my job definition. It's like, for me, I do those things, but not just for me, but for the communities that I'm around. So not really curatorial, but essential for me, yeah.
I think that for me, I rely on the pedagogical structures and vehicles. I need that to respond to like a framework for understanding institutions or other kinds of spaces. So not relying on institution necessarily. Also because, but then it's like all that educational turn stuff, nothing changed after that, right? Like bullying accords still happen, the museums and institutions just became more about branding and fundraising even more and becoming, so it's like that whole democratization, it was a stage show, like what really, so like then I'm like now less about thinking of the educational vehicle as something that's always good. It's actually can be captured and aestheticized, and so now I'm thinking more interiorly about deeper questions about, I mean, there were, that's another story, I guess, but I just sort of, it failed, right? Like, and I don't have a lot of, I think institutions are extremely fraught, and I think vehicles like pedagogy and education, I don't know, they're not innocent. And I'm not going to say that what I do, like what I did was a good thing. I mean, the gatherings have changed my life and changed others, and I'm not saying it was because of the people that came who also were working in survival modes, but also the common theme was they work with these educational vehicles but really transgress them, or it was always in reference to boundaries. So I don't need this, but I do, the vehicles are extremely important, and they continue to be, but not instant.
Pamela, did you want to say anything, Pamela?
Oh, yeah. I wear the golden handcuffs. So, as you know, Michelle, I work in public education. And what I mean by that is, I'm banking a pension, and I'm fortunate to do that with my position as a high school teacher. But I also have benefits and stuff. But, I was saying to Elise and SF yesterday in the car, if I walked away from teaching, would I need $2,000 worth of mental health support? Right? Because I wouldn't be so ill. I wouldn't need the care I do. I see a chiropractor 3 times a week. I do a lot of somatic healing. I do a lot of work. I would like to call it my mental health breakthrough that I had 5 years ago, but it changed everything. Everything shifted. And actually, I'd like to mark that even further back. 2008 is when we started to see the pedagogical turn. But we were doing, before social practice, it was socially engaged. And before socially engaged, it was relational. Thank you, Rickrit. Right? And we weren't so much about object-oriented ontology and whatnot, and it was more about the experiential. But for me as a K-12 educator, I do socially engaged work, social practice, relational work every day for 10 months of the year with other people's children. And what really shifted for me is I started to see that, oh my gosh, look at this. So I work in the art community and I work in public education. Whoa, look at all these broken souls coming in, and I can't patch them up in 5 months or 10 months. I started to realize what artists needed. And slow process, slow wave, that was a fantastic model that Elise shared with me in SF. I got to know a little bit now with you one-on-one. And these things started to matter more, right? There's a reason why yoga and meditation are multi-million-dollar industries. I know I bring this up, Emelie, in every talk we do, but yoga is a $9 billion industry. I'm not trying to be funny. It is a spiritual practice from where I come from and my roots. And when you take the spirit out of something, is it so I had to really re-examine through my breakthrough what is purpose and what is passion. And we don't talk about that in workplace culture. What wakes you up in the morning besides your alarm clock or maybe your 6 alarm clocks? But what gets you up and says, yeah, that's a good day? And I recently asked this to Emelie. What motivated you to do this graffiti project? Because I was like, you are nonstop blabbing about graffiti artists to me all the time. And then brown butter. I'm clearly like not even the, like I'm the cold, kale on the table right now. Move to the side. And I'm just going to listen to you go on about your love affair with graffiti artists right now. But at least I'm making the space and taking the space to do that for my friend. And I say that with so much love and admiration for Emelie's practice, because I know what she's doing with me, which is when she shares stories with me, I'm learning, I'm observing. When she asks me questions about my pedagogy, she's learning too. So we have that collegiality around pedagogy, because we've also been talking about the museum as as a school for a very, very long time. Whereas other curators in Toronto would think I was quote unquote crazy to work with my students and bring them into a gallery and not be at the bottom of the AGO with them. Right? Thank you to FAG, aka Deirdre Logan, Alison Mitchell, who allowed us, Boner Kill to have its first public program, because the TDSB decided to ban me because I was teacher facilitating a young women's group that was called Boner Kill, and they didn't want bad press after certain things that happened in the city. We don't want Joe Warmington on this. And I was like, who the hell is Joe Warmington? And then when I talked to Allison, she's like, oh, the Toronto Sun. And I was like, oh, okay. Right? So that's the kind of risk I take as a public educator. But I know when to really go for that hard, like when I want to show up for my youth. And because just like myself, I didn't have, my mom did the best she could with the means she had after my dad passed. And Emelie's always reminding me to love her hard. But it's difficult, right? So she was my formal training and whatnot. But then my art moms, Winsome, Lillian, Althea Prince, Makeda Silvera, they're not in the canon. I mean, they're not really... They're on the periphery, but I think now there is a concerted effort around making this knowledge available. And it's what I'm trying to get at, Michelle, and you know this too, is the work that you've done. Like a lot of people were watching you. I was watching you, but I wasn't quite like in your orbit perhaps, but you were watching me. Like we were all observing and watching each other grow, right? And I'm not even talking about this loved one. That's on my shirt right now because I needed to channel some love from Queen Street, Queer Street West, where I have really benefited from that kind of activity. Marilyn and I, my long-term partner and I, we used to show up on Queen Street, and we stuck out in mainly white rooms because you wouldn't see. There was this term called lesbian once. I think it still exists, but you wouldn't see a brown lesbian couple show up at art events. We were the only ones that would show up, and we kept showing up, and people would notice, like, oh shit, you come to 3 of my things. I haven't come to anything. And I'm like, it's okay. But that's a form of love. That's a form of care, right? What is care? Care, the root of care is love.
Aw. Oh yeah, I think Allison had a question first, and then.
Sorry, I'll stop talking.
No, thank you.
I hope you never stop talking. And this is my favorite panel. I love hearing all of you talk about these genealogies, and I could listen to it all day. It is so fascinating to me. I love it. And so often what came up was when you were talking were about like these connections, making connections with people. And, you know, in the art world, I mourn the part of the pandemic that has kept us from being able to make those kinds of connections. And also the curation of the connections, like a couple of you talked about when somebody said, you have to meet, and then brought you together to meet, and how life-changing or path-changing that was for you. And I'm thinking a little bit about how, and I'm wondering, my question is around happenstance and openness, and wondering about, you know, in that moment when that happens, are you conscious of that at the time, or does that only come to you in reflection afterwards of the impact of that connection? I mean, I'm not sure. I'm just kind of putting it out to you to think about or to talk about.
So I think like what Nasrin has done with this panel is like allowed the emergence to, even if we've talked about it before, maybe we are conscious of the connections and how transformative it was, we have to keep, because we change. Like I talked about something from 2007, right? And like, yeah, but we've changed. We're completely different people. And so when Nasrin asked this question, like it'll emerge in a completely different way. So like I'm thinking about like feminist art gallery and the you know, the people who've inspired you, the hello stickers, like the introduction stickers, and how those relationships would become, they've transformed and changed. And like if we have, it's not like, oh, it's done, archived, out of the way. This is like an archive that it continues to emerge through a question like this. So again, another pedagogical structure, but it's not about the structure, it's about the intent and the transformative, you know, like possible, like potent, I don't know what the word is, but yeah, like I think that's extremely, the intention that you brought here, I think allowed these things that were probably different for you 10 years ago. So I think it's so important to emerge, have these connections re-emerge and talk about they are different because we're different. So yeah, I think.
Yeah, and I think it's because we've been talking also so much here, and I was at a conference in Ottawa too, that was put on by all these national new media and film organizations through the storm. And I just don't want us to forget that a lot of what the questions that come up now have also come up earlier, in the 70s and 80s and 90s. And when you look through the archives of these different organizations, artist-run centers and different institutions, like there are a lot of racialized and queer staff who were trying to figure these things out back then too. And it's kind of incredible to think that the same questions keep emerging in these different forms, and to remember, to have a memory that people came before us, and this is, Pamela, why your show is so important, and paved the way for so much to happen now, and that continues. And I think one of my questions was also like, what would your mentors now too, and so I'll just wait for the ringer. Yeah. What was the question? Sorry, yes. My question, one of my questions, just to follow up Allison's, was, what do you say to the next generations? Like, how do you feel about being a mentor yourself?
They're calling. Like, get your ass over here. The next generation. What do I say? Well, right now, you know, the youth that I work with, there's a crisis. You know, we've had 2 years of a pandemic, very nervous, so I do a lot of I don't really do direct healing or anything, but I use a lot of contemplative modalities in my classroom, inside and outside, and with my youth that I work with in Bonerkill and either younger artists and whatnot. Sometimes they just, Maxine Bailey. I love Max, but she used to say like, Pamela, you pay the black tax, and the black tax is like, your white colleague can roll in late because they were at a work event last night and no questions asked, but the black tax is I roll in late and there's questions asked. So I was like, oh my gosh, Maxine, that's brilliant. And I still talk to my mentors, Maxine being one of them. She worked a long time at TIFF. In fact, she was obviously with her team, her development team, they created the new TIFF Bell Lightbox, and she is also a sister to Cameron Bailey. But that doesn't, Maxine was a trailblazer with like Afrocentric theater and whatnot with Sharon Lewis, and they had sisters, and they were doing amazing things. And I was watching all of this, not in high school, but in my early, like the same time that Dish and Sister Vision Press and Theater in the Rough and Dr. Amma Harris was working. And I also had to do my work. Like, I didn't expect people to teach me. So I tell, like, if I talk about Yonge Street Uprising, I'm like, it's on Google, go look at it, like, do your work. I wasn't handed a reading list or a syllabus or any of these things that started to come about in the last generation. I was told to, like, it was like, okay, Malcolm X, I'll go to the library, Marcus Garvey, I write down these names, and we would be given a reading. So in terms of, I don't have that kind of stuff that I don't give them anything really. I don't, like Sister Co-Resistor, we don't even have a logo. I just bought one for $26 recently. I was like, yes, we have a logo now. It's on lavender. What do I tell them? They just call me up and they're like, hey, can we have a coffee or something, or can you make me dinner? I'm like, okay. And I just listen, just what my mentors still do, but the generation has changed in which the internet really means a lot to them. They have a relationship with the internet and they stopped having a relationship with people. I think that's what I avoided with Boner Kill, is like not having a social media presence, that you had to actually show up to meetings and have dialogue and be relational. And it really freaked out the introverted members. That, what? You're going to make me talk? And I was like, yeah. But not like school. It's going to be like, And I don't like this, sure, of course it's kinship and developing kinship, but I don't like this, like sometimes when I have South Asian youth contact me and they're like, auntie, and I'm like, I'm not your auntie. Like, I'm not your, like, if you want to deal with me as a mentor, because also I come from 5,000 years of culture where guru shishya is something that's very important. What I mean by that is like a guru and a shishya is a mentee. Guru is your mentor, and a guru means teacher. And I come from the Sikh faith, and we have 10 gurus, right? So they're not gods, which everyone are like, oh, do you pray to your god? I'm like, no, they're elders now. They're spiritual elders, So. But then I also learned how to adapt that to like movement elders. So I talked to my youth about that. Okay, like put down these lists, keep them in your notes. When you're feeling nervous or something, here's a quote. Or what did Audrey say? What did Tony say? What did all these people? I still use that stuff for myself when I'm feeling like, and I really hate this idea of when friends, younger friends, artist friends who are like, what do they call it? Faking it till you make it. And I'm like, no, you're not faking it. Be real, be authentic. You don't need to be anything else but you, right? And that's what I was taught and modeled, So I just really don't like the faking it till you make it. And that was like probably the generation, millennials, who started to really use that terminology, and I didn't like it at all. So I was like, no, figure out who you are. And that's what Winsome said. The first questions are like, who are you? And I'm like, oh my God. You can spend entire practice figuring out who you are. Yeah. Like till I'm 101. Totally. I can just figure out who I am. And there's an audience, or maybe there isn't an audience around that. Where are you from? Right? And Fred Moten says, how'd you get here? I love that strategy. How'd you get here with a class or a group? What's your story?
Yeah.
How'd you get here? And there's many social justice practitioners who use the river model or whatever model, or like, you know, you were a star in the universe. How did you, you know? Yeah, that's it.
Yeah, thank you, Pamela. We are at 11:30, but I wanted to give someone else a chance to answer.
Or you want to... We're into the long haul. Just keep talking. Any other questions up there? Yeah.
I did. Yes, sorry. I just wanted to give, if others wanted to answer that question.
Oh, yeah.
Did you guys are good?
Yeah.
Please come back.
No. Please come back. Oh.
I just wanted to add to the kind of temporal continuum here. And first of all, congratulate all of you for showing us what a vibrant ecosystem that you partake in and foster. It's so important. I trained in the arts in my 20s. That was 40 years ago and then some. And everything has changed. When I started, the institutional requirement to choose a specific area which would be a territory for you to protect against others, the system of entering into institutions where you started at the lowest rung, and if you hung in there long enough, like decades, you would go from the assistant to the research assistant all the way up to being a full curator. The only options were to be in deep institutions or in academia. And to see how these modalities have proliferated and grown is so encouraging to me. I myself broke away quite a long time ago from the rigidity of those structures, but I do feel dipping back into academic practice and museum practice is a great way to get new fuel to get projects going that are more local and personal. I just wanted to congratulate you on that.
Thank you.
I'm happy to answer the last question about mentoring and stuff.
Thank you.
Because
Go for it.
I think it's important. Like for me, I'm always like, believe in your lived experience, bring that to what you do, and there will be resistors. Change will there'll always be resistors, but in enough time, and if you stick to your guns, everything will change around you, and the discourse will change. And you will find yourself in a situation where that's valued. So like, yeah, I mean, I think it's about like valuing your contribution and not getting hung up on other people's expectations of what your contribution or your value is. Because it will change. I mean, no one like got the projects I was doing. They were like, it's community arts. And like, no one gave a shit about Jane Finch. No one came. And like, people would have the audacity to say to me, oh, I love your work. I just never see it because it's like so far away. And I'm like, well, it's not far away if you're, for someone in Jane Finch, it ain't far away. So like, maybe I'm not doing it for you. And I think that is always what I'm like trying to articulate to practitioners today, to just keep doing it. And don't assimilate.
I think that's crucial. Like the don't assimilate and trust your lived experience and believe in what comes from that.
And maybe to add to that change that you're doing, and when you're talking about stories, like keeping the stories alive, to keep in mind that, and what you mentioned about the people who've been working in the arts before, like in the decades before, is that we're not just changing the future, but it changes the past. Because when you do that, you're like activating something, this precedent or this story or this perspective, just like we're changing. So I think this nonlinear perspective as you transform the world in like a one direction, helps you be more expansive and more open and more grounded, rather than it being this trajectory of progress, because that's the institutional trajectory. So like this we're remembering that we're changing the past as we go. The archive being alive, right? Like.
Yeah, I strongly suggest you Google generative somatics, and they have this graph where you're in the middle, and it's actually like layers, right? You're in the middle, and then it's your immediate family, then your your community, your institutions. So these are all layers that you exist in, right? And it all comes falling down when you're not taking care of the heart, right? So you're constantly returning to yourself, right? You can spend $5,000 at a Chopra retreat or just listen to what I just said, because I did spend that $5,000 and I was like, shit, I already knew all this. So coming back to yourself is the most beautiful action you can take. That is a practice in itself, right? So contemplative practice is a real thing. And also Google Tree of Contemplative Practices.
Bopha, did you have any last words?
Maybe I was just thinking as we were speaking, like I was thinking a lot about Lai Wan, an artist in Vancouver, and just the way she kind of embodies everything that you've just mentioned. And I kind of see her as an informal mentor, but there's definitely nothing linear about the way Lai Wan does things. And I think one of the things that she has taught me in working with her, and like some recent mentorship projects and work that I've done, is just to really be as expansive. Like I think we're always like, we're in a deficit. We're in a time deficit, space, money, etc., whatever, emotions, feelings. And to actually realize that we're not in a deficit. Like to kind of really switch that and be like, actually we have a lot of room. We have a lot of time. We make it, we take it, we give it. And just this, I was reading this interview with this poet, I'm blanking now, but it's called Generosity as Method. And I think, generosity to yourself, but to the people you're working with and your friends and peers too. I was doing this Center A arts writing mentorship, and, I really went into it with a syllabus thinking that we were going to be looking at each other like paragraph structure. And I was like, no, that's not what they want at all. It's like they actually just wanted to hang out and read together and speak, and it was really great. Like I felt like I always learn just as much from the people I'm supposedly meant to be mentoring. It's like very reciprocal. So yeah, I think I just wanted to add that it's reciprocal.
Yeah. Thank you. I also want to just do a shout out to Michelle Jakes, who's been my mentor, and learning a lot from you so much. Yeah. Thank you all. I think that's it. And thank you so much to our panelists. Thank you all for your questions and comments. And yeah, we'll see you now at lunch.